Good afternoon, everyone. I am Matt Clark with Veritas CFO, and today we're reviewing some of the second quarter 2020 financial and operating key performance indicators of some publicly traded truckload carriers, USA Truck, US Express, and Covenant Transport. We'll also review some metrics for their brokerage divisions. First, on the truckload side, USA Truck reported base revenue per loaded mile of $2.02 in the second quarter of this year versus $2.14 in the second quarter of last year, a drop of about 12 cents driven by overcapacity in the market, which reduced rates. Also contributing to the decrease was that they had more freight secured in the spot market this year versus contract freight. US Express reported average revenue per loaded mile of $2.05 in the second quarter of this year versus $2.12 in the second quarter of last year, the main driver of the decrease also due to pressure on rates driven by excess capacity in the market. And Covenant Transport reported average revenue per loaded mile basically flat, $2.03 in the second quarter of this year versus $2.04 in the second quarter of last year. Covenant also reported that two of its large automotive customers remained shut down for most of the quarter due to COVID-19. For base revenue per tractor per week, USA Truck reported $3,003 in the second quarter of this year versus $3,350 in the second quarter of 2019. The decrease driven by the drop in base revenue per loaded mile. US Express reported $3,793 in the second quarter of this year versus $3,792 in the second quarter of last year, driven by a decrease in its over-the-road segment, offset by an increase in its dedicated segment. The increase in the dedicated segment was driven by higher miles per tractor, partially offset by lower rates. And Covenant Transport reported a decrease to $3,647 in the second quarter of this year versus $3,767 in the second quarter of last year, driven by a 2% decrease in the number of miles driven combined with a 0.9% lower rate per mile. On the operating ratio, USA Truck reported an OR of 98.7% in its trucking segment in the second quarter of this year versus an OR of 99.1% in the second quarter of last year, driven by the lower revenue from reduced rates. US Express reported an OR of 94.6% in the second quarter of 2020 versus 98% in the second quarter of last year. The company noted that its new digital fleet was having a positive impact on its operations, along with the company's focus on reducing fixed and variable costs. The CEO of US Express discussed this new digital fleet during the FreightWaves Carrier Summit. This is a very interesting concept and will be interesting how it plays out for US Express and across the trucking industry. Finally, Covenant Transport reported an OR for their truckload segment of 117.9% in the second quarter of this year versus 97% in the second quarter of last year. The company reported a net $29.3 million of restructuring costs for the quarter related to the sale of one of its terminals, downsizing unprofitable operations, and reallocating fleet assets. For deadhead percent, USA Truck reported an increase from 12.7% in the second quarter of last year to 13.1% in the second quarter of this year. And Covenant reported a deadhead percent of 10.1% in the second quarter of this year versus 9.7% in the second quarter of last year. US Express didn't report their percent deadhead. On the brokerage side, USA Truck reported a gross margin percent of 12.2% in the second quarter of this year versus 16.5% in the second quarter of last year, driven by a 15% decrease in revenue per load, although the number of loads did increase. US Express reported a gross margin percent of 8.1% in the second quarter of this year versus 16.1% in the second quarter of last year, mainly due to a $204 drop in revenue per load, although the number of loads increased for them also. and Covenant didn't report their gross margin rate. On revenue per load for brokerage, USA Truck reported $1,160 per load in the second quarter of this year versus $1,374 in the second quarter of last year due to a tougher rate market, and US Express reported revenue per load of $1,124 in the second quarter of this year versus $1,328 in the second quarter of last year, also due to the tough rate market. And Covenant also didn't report their revenue per load. One last note, to be clear, our comments are not intended as a recommendation to buy or sell any securities of these companies. We hope this has been helpful to you. Please let us know your comments and feedback below, and make it a great day.